Welcome, everyone. Thanks for coming. I'm James Ward. I'm the engineering and open source ambassador at Salesforce. So this session is about open source, the who, what, why, and how. So a little bit about me. Oh, before we do that, of course, there's the forward-looking statement, safe harbor slide. Make sure you review that and understand that. All right, so a little bit about me. So I'm an engineer on the engineering team at Salesforce, and I get to work on a lot of open source. So I've been working on open source for a number of years, and you can see from my GitHub contributions, I had a vacation in April and a vacation in December. Those were nice. But other than that, I spend a lot of time contributing to open source on a variety of projects that I'll talk about in a little bit. Okay, so let's talk about open source. So first, the who. So who can do open source? Really, anyone can do open source. It doesn't matter what skill level you're at. There's always a place in open source projects that need contributions from any level developer. How many people here have made an open source contribution before? Couple of people? Okay. So hopefully after this session, you all know that you can do open source and how to do open source, why you would want to do open source. And if you're already doing open source, great. I'll have some tips at the end to help you be a better open source contributor. All right, so anyone can do open source, but there are often some challenges to doing open source, especially in the corporate world. And so as someone who's employed by a company, you probably signed an employment agreement with them, and that employment agreement may have pose some legal challenges for you to actually do open source. So I'm going to talk about what those challenges are, how you might be able to work through those. So here's what usually is the case in most employment agreements, is that if you are working on company time or company equipment, then what you work on technically belongs to the company. And so if you want to do open source, this can be a challenge because you are essentially taking something that is owned by the company and giving that to someone else. So there's an IP issue that you may have to work through with that. But we'll talk about how we deal with that in a little bit. One of the ways that some companies deal with this is that they create an official process that you go through. So if you're working on company time or company equipment, and if you go through the official process for doing open source, then the company lets you do that. And so that's one thing to figure out is, can you do open source? Certainly you can always do it, well, depending on your employment agreement. I'm not a lawyer, but review your employment agreement. You hopefully can do open source on your own time and on your own equipment. But if you're on company time, maybe you have to go through an official process in order to actually do open source. Now, there might be some legal or executive concerns around doing open source, and this is definitely beginning to change, but I think the kind of traditional organizations are very kind of hesitant to do open source, and we'll talk about some ways that we can work through those challenges in a little bit. But I thought it'd be fun to play the Stodgy Enterprise game. So this is a game where what we do is we search to see if a stodgy enterprise company does open source. So give me a stodgy enterprise company. Let's see if they do open source. FedEx? Okay, so let's search for FedEx and GitHub. So let's see, there's some libraries to interact with FedEx. Oh, it's not looking good for FedEx here. Not looking like the FedEx does a lot of open source. So if you work at FedEx, we will come up with some ways to help you work through that in a little bit. Let's try another one. Let's try what's General Electric. General Electric. So it looks like they do have a GitHub account, so that's great, and looks like they're contributing to Polymer. That's an exciting HTML project, and have some other projects that they have open source. So that's great to see. You know, a very large company has a presence on GitHub, is doing open source. So I think that bodes well for many of us. Maybe our companies are already doing open source, and so that'll help us out when we want to contribute to open source. Okay, thanks for playing the stodgy enterprise game. You can feel free to play that on your own. It's pretty fun to search around, see who's doing open source out there. Okay, so let's move on from the who to the what of open source. So what should you work on in open source? What I work on most of the time is a project called WebJars, and it's now getting quite a few downloads every month, so that's exciting. It started just as a little project that I was basically just solving a problem that I had, which was to use a Java-based package manager and consume JavaScript and HTML libraries. And that was something that I wanted to solve, so I solved it for myself, made it open source, and now a lot of people are using it. So exciting to see that, just a little side project could blossom into something that's being used by a lot of people. So for you, what should you do for open source? So I think the first thing to consider is, what are you interested in? What kind of excites you? What are you passionate about? Maybe that's like, I'm really into message queue systems, or maybe I'm into like file wrapper libraries, file IO wrapper libraries, or whatever it is. Maybe you're just you aren't interested in technology. Solving those kinds of problems, but one of the open source projects I built a long time ago was an app that was a budgeting app for my family. I noticed that my wife was spending more money than I'd like on clothes, and so I solved the problem by creating a budgeting app and open sourced it. This was back in the WAML days. Does anybody remember WAML? It was a WAML app, so she could actually, from her Nokia little phone, enter her expenses. Turned out the whole idea was flawed because she never actually entered her expenses, and so we didn't do any budgeting, but it was a nice idea, a fun way to do some open source. Okay, so what interests you? These can be technology problems, these can be outside of technology problems, but definitely start with what's a problem that you have? What's something that you want to solve? If you are a consumer of open source, then this provides a great opportunity to contribute back to that project, because being a user of open source, you see things that can be better. Maybe you're encountering bugs, maybe you're encountering lacking documentation, maybe you're encountering a lack of good sample applications. So when you're working with open source projects and consuming them, it can be a really good way to spur some ideas for how you could improve those projects. A lot of the open source that I've done is just sample applications built around open source frameworks that I've used, because that's what I would often notice is, oh man, getting started with this thing is really hard. And if I just had a sample application to help get me started. So I've built a lot of samples, and that's what a lot of my open source has been. Do you want to create something new? So like WebJars, there was no one else that was doing something like WebJars at the time, so it was fun to start from scratch and then all of a sudden start spending all my nights and weekends maintaining this monster that I had created. But it can definitely be fulfilling to come up with something from scratch. So when we're working on company time, maybe it's not necessarily about our interests, but maybe it's about something that we're working on at work that we want to open source. And oftentimes when you're working at a company that's not an open source company, you're working at a company like Salesforce and you want to do open source, then the easiest kind of path to doing open source in that case is to take things that are not the special sauce of the company. Because if it's the special sauce, if it's that secret recipe of your company, then you're probably going to get a lot of resistance to open sourcing it. But if it's not the special sauce, if it's some tool that you built, or if it's some infrastructure that you built or something like that, then that can be a really great place to say, hey, it would be great to open source this. And we'll get to the advantages of doing that in a minute. But that can be a great place to do open source, is just by taking something that you've built for work that is not the company's special sauce and open sourcing it. So oftentimes that's infrastructure or tools, sample applications, those sorts of things. So another great place to do open source is actually tools for open source. At Salesforce, we do quite a bit of open source, and we've had to build some tools to help us do open source better. So one of those we'll talk about in a little bit is called the Contributor License Agreement Bot, and we'll talk about the details of that. But there's a lot of lacking around tools for companies to actually do open source. And so if you're interested in open source and want to help the open source community, especially the enterprise open source community, building tools around this is a really good way to help out. There's an organization called the To-Do Group that is a bunch of large companies doing open source, talking about the tools that they need and the processes that they use. So if you join the To-Do Group, that'd be a great way to discover some of the tools that you could potentially build for open source. So as I mentioned, Salesforce, we do a lot of open source. You can find out more information of that at salesforce.github.io is our website for the information about that. Okay, now why? So we've covered the who, what, now onto the why. So a lot of times the perception of open source is that we're just shoveling money and burning it, right? Shoveling it into the fire and burning money. And so why would we want to do that? Why would we want to just throw money away? So let's talk about why open source. So for you, these are your personal motivations for doing open source, which are different than corporate motivations for doing open source. We'll start with the personal ones. A big one is that you may want to show off your skills. So you may want to impress some future employer that you may want to work at, and you want to impress your friends and your peers. And it can definitely be motivating to be able to actually show them what you've built. A lot of times when we're working at companies writing software, there's no way to really show off what we've done. Maybe we can point to some button that we added to Salesforce or whatever you've built in your product. But really what we're often proud of is the code that we write and how we solve problems and the problems that we solve. And so in open source, it gives us the opportunity to take that and actually put it out there so that everyone can see it and then can criticize it, of course, too. And that certainly happens to me a lot with open source, is that people say, hey, why did you do it that way? That's wrong. And so you kind of have to build a thick skin when you're doing open source. But can definitely be a good way to let future employers know what you can do and how you do it. Another good reason is maybe you need a hobby. I definitely like writing code and learning new things for fun. And so I've spent a lot of my nights and weekends working on open source, and that's just fun for me. Certainly I could go outside, but oftentimes if the weather's bad, right, just pull up the computer and sit by the fire and write some open source code. Pretty fun. Learn something new. So oftentimes when I'm learning a new technology, a new framework, a new programming language, then as I'm going through that learning process, it allows me to go through the documentation of a project and make contributions to the documentation to help it get better, build those sample projects, those sorts of things. So it can definitely be a good part of the learning process, not just for myself, but for other people as well. Okay, then for your company. So talked about why personally you'd want to do open source. What about a company? Why would a company want to do open source? A big reason at Salesforce for us doing open source is trust. So when we open source something, we're essentially saying, hey, you can trust us. So an example of this is the Lightning Framework. The Lightning Framework is open source. It's called Aura, is the open source brand. And by open sourcing the foundation of Lightning, we can build trust with our company, with our partners and with our customers that this framework, it's open source and other people can be building on it, other people can be helping us find security issues in it and those sorts of things. So trust is a big one for us. Recruiting, I think, is one of the biggest angles for large organizations to do open source. So when we do open source, we open ourselves up to a pool of developers that we wouldn't normally have access to for not doing open source. We have some pretty amazing talent at Salesforce that came to Salesforce working on an open source project. So an example of this is part of the Einstein platform is something called Prediction.io. That's an open source toolkit for machine learning, and it has been open source since it started. And so when we acquired Prediction.io, we brought on some really talented developers to come work at Salesforce and work on open source and work on Einstein. So that's one angle, is just being able to attract a whole new pool of developers when we do open source. Another angle to recruiting is that when we receive a contribution from somebody outside of our company to a project, to an open source project of ours, all of a sudden that becomes a really good way to discover candidates who would be great to come work on those projects full time. And so if someone sends us a pull request, like great, like that's a great indicator that this person would be a great fit on the team. So recruiting is a big one for us. Another big one is ecosystem building. So I mentioned Lightning Framework being open source, and so to build an ecosystem around a technology, it's certainly easier to build those ecosystems when the technology is open source than if it's closed source. I really don't think we could build a ecosystem around a component framework if it weren't open source. And so by open sourcing something can be a great way to build a community, build an ecosystem, get people making contributions and contributing to a project. So last reason here for why a company would want to do open source is that unmerged forks suck. So I'll explain this a little bit. What this means is that when you consume open source, there's different ways to consume it. You could either consume the artifacts of the project, essentially the compiled versions of a project, and then never make any changes to those. And that's fine, and we do that a lot. But there are times when you consume an open source project, and you do this by forking the project. So you actually fork the source code. And the reason why you typically do that is that you need to make some changes to that project before you can actually use it in the way that you need to use it. So this creates a fork of the project with some changes on it. And those changes, if we never contribute them back to the open source project, they become an unmerged fork. And the downside of this is that as time moves forward, we are stuck on this version that when we forked the project, we have that version of the upstream code, and we've made changes based on that version. But because we never merged our changes back into the upstream, we're essentially never going to be able to keep up with what's going on in the upstream. So we're not getting any of the features, we're not getting any of the bug fixes, we're not getting the security fixes, we're not getting any of the benefits of what's happening in that upstream project because we have this unmerged fork. So a great reason why we contribute to a lot of existing open source projects at Salesforce is to be able to take those changes that we've made and contribute them back into the upstream code so that then we can stay back in sync with the changes and features that are happening in that upstream project. So it really becomes a maintenance nightmare if you don't do that. And unfortunately, kind of the default mode for most enterprises consuming open source, if they need to make changes, is to have these unmerged forks. And there's a lot of risk to doing that. Typically, the reason why those contributions don't make it back is because doing open source in corporations has traditionally been hard. So it's hard. So sometimes doing open source kind of feels very daunting, feels like you're crossing this bridge that's very wobbly and has a whole lot of air beneath it and is very scary. And so next section I want to go into is the actual how. How do we actually get to the point where we can make contributions and do it well and feel secure going across that bridge of open source? So first thing is GitHub. GitHub is really the center of the developer world now for open source. So there are other ways to do open source. There's old SourceForge, there's things like Bitbucket, and those are great tools, but where open source development happens today is on GitHub. So you really want to be using GitHub if you are doing open source today. So next way to do open source is to read the contributor's guide. Most mature open source projects will have a contribution guide. So the contribution guide lays out, if you want to contribute to this project, here's the things that you need to be aware of. Here's the processes that are used. Here's the actual mechanics of how you make a contribution. So things like oftentimes, open source projects will ask you to take all of your commits in a contribution and collapse them all down into a single commit and then make your contribution with that single commit. So that's something that's usually outlined in the contributor's guide for how you would do that and why you would do that and other processes that might be in place. So if it's a mature project, definitely check out the contributor's guide. The next one is kind of similar, is when you make a contribution to a project, it's definitely helpful to understand how the project works, how people communicate, the style, the culture, all those things. And so a great way to do that in open source is just to read through what exists already, read through the issues, read through the pull requests that are already there, and use those as a way to understand the culture, the processes, the style of the project. And it's all out there and open, so it's easy to understand that culture before you go make a contribution. And that just makes things usually flow quite a bit smoother. So now we'll talk about the legal side at companies, which is fun. These are called CLAs, which is Contributor License Agreement. So what a contributor license agreement does is when you make a contribution, you're actually giving over ownership of that contribution to the open source project, and then they license you back that code that you contributed. And this is done because it'd be a real pain if every line in an open source project had different ownership, because then you wouldn't be able to easily relicense the project. You wouldn't, if you had any legal issues around ownership, it would be really hard to figure out, who is responsible for the actual line of code that's in question. And so what mature open source projects do is they require a contributor license agreement to be signed in order to actually make a contribution. Oftentimes, we've automated this process on GitHub so that when you make a contribution, if you have not signed a CLA, then it asks you to sign the CLA, and we automate that. But it gets a little bit tricky because there are two types of CLAs. There's individual CLAs, or ICLAs, and there's corporate CLAs. So the individual CLA essentially says that I am authorized to give over ownership of this code. And at Salesforce, for some cases, I'm not actually authorized to change ownership of what I'm contributing from Salesforce to the person that I'm the open source project. And so it would actually be wrong for me, if there was ever a legal issue there, to actually sign an ICLA. So there's another type of CLA, which is the corporate CLA, and the corporate CLA has the corporation actually execute a legal agreement with the open source project and then lists the contributors who are covered under the CCLA. And so that any contributions coming in from those contributors, the company has said, okay, we provide the ability to reassign ownership from the company to the open source project. So this is something you get into when you work with large companies, with legal teams around open source. If you're working with individual developers, then you probably won't have to deal with CLAs. But definitely, anytime there's a company with a legal team behind open source, you'll have to figure out how to go through the CLA process. Okay, so that's the how. So then the next one, which I've mentioned a few times, is that your company may not have a process. So it looks like FedEx doesn't have a process for doing open source. And a couple of years ago, Salesforce didn't have a process for doing open source either. So what we did was we came up with a process. So we worked with the legal team, we worked with the security team, and the executives, and we actually got a process put together that allows our employees to contribute to open source and take open source that they've built internally and open source it. And so I'm not going to go into a lot of details on that process today, but just to give you a little bit of overview of what has to happen to do open source at Salesforce. We do a patent review. So this is our legal team looking at the open source that's being contributed and seeing, is there anything patentable that we've missed, or are there any existing patents on what we're contributing? And that isn't necessarily a showstopper for doing open source. It's just that they want to be aware of that before they actually do the open source. And then there are some open source projects that have you assign over any patents associated with the contribution to the open source organization. And so they just want to be aware of all that and work through that. So there's the patent review. Then there's a license review where they look at the licenses that are used in the open source project. So if I'm open sourcing a project that I've created, then they're going to look at what's my license and what's the license of any dependencies that I have in my project, and just make sure essentially that there's not any viral licensing. So viral license is like the GPL license, and so the legal team wants to make sure that we're not getting ourselves into a sticky legal situation by making a contribution with a viral license. And then we do a security review, and so depending on how the code is actually used in Salesforce, the security review can differ. Sometimes it's pretty in-depth, and sometimes it's pretty lightweight, depending on how the code is actually being used inside of Salesforce. And then, of course, we require executive approval as kind of the final step to make sure that, yep, what we're open sourcing is good for Salesforce, and it's not going to be embarrassing, and it's not going to go against any product strategy that we currently have going on. So to manage this whole process at Salesforce, we have a team of volunteers called the Open Source Core Team that are volunteers that help all the employees at Salesforce work through this process to do open source. So that's how we've done it, and we created that process. If you want more information on how to do that at your company, I wish I could point you to how we've done it. I did a presentation at OSCON, which was recorded, but I think you have to have an account on O'Reilly, so that's not a good place to look. My slides are on my blog, jamesward.com, so you could go through the slides. But a better resource is that Google has taken all of their process documentation for how they do open source, and they've open sourced it. And so that is a great tool where if you want to introduce open source into your organization, start with the documentation that Google has put together on how they do open source and the process that they use, and that would be a really good foundation to start with. And you can do it. Really what I've found is that the legal team, they seem scary, but oftentimes they're a lot more helpful than I expected them to be. They want to support the engineers in doing these kinds of things. They're not just no, no, no. So I found our lawyers to be really helpful in this regard. So it is scary going across that bridge, but sit down with them, explain to them. A lot of times they just want to have understanding of what the risks are and how to mitigate those risks, and it can be done. Okay, so that's the how. Let's talk about how not to do open source. So one is that sometimes when you're working on an existing open source project, you need to make some customizations to that project that maybe don't fit with what the upstream project exists for. And so it's, if you need these kinds of customizations, I'd highly recommend not to do that unmerged fork thing, but figure out how to extend the base project to add the functionality that you need. And maybe that means you need to make a contribution to the open source project to give you the right points to extend from. But then once you open up those points, then you can have a library that wraps that project and allows you to have your custom functionality on top of that. So don't do company-specific contributions. Don't be mean or demanding. Unfortunately, I see this a lot, even with my little WebJars project. People are like, I need this thing now. And I'm like, dude, it's like, it's the middle of the day. And, I save it for nights and weekends, so if you can just wait a few hours. So sometimes you do get some mean and demanding people in open source, and it's unfortunate. But yeah, don't be mean and demanding to open source people. Most of the time, they're doing this out of the goodness of their heart. And so be helpful to them. Okay, so something that I often see a lot with organizations, I'm sure FedEx is in this bucket, not to pick on FedEx, but it was a good example, was that a lot of large organizations consume a lot of open source, but don't necessarily give much back. And hopefully that's beginning to change, and I think that the barriers to doing open source are getting a lot lower, so hopefully we can change that. I don't think people didn't want to give back, it's just that it was hard to give back. So give back. Waste dumping. So this is another fun one that I see quite a bit is a company will say, okay, we built this thing, now let's open source it. And they just like dump it out there and then don't ever maintain it. They just expect like all of a sudden like the community to take over ownership of this thing and do all the maintenance on it. And that doesn't happen in open source. Like don't just dump a project out there and expect like magically people are gonna want to like take your hunk of junk and make it into a beautiful car. Like that's not gonna happen. When you do open source, you need to be a steward and a manager and a maintainer of what you're open sourcing. And then I think the last one here is that oftentimes what I see in open source is people will try to use developer channels around a project for support, and that's just kind of poor form. Like, there are usually support channels for open source projects. Use the support channels. Don't like go into a developer forum or a developer chat group and start like getting support on an open source project. Dev channels are for development on a project and contributions, and support forums are for support, obviously. So use the right channels there. It really gets annoying to open source maintainers when people are asking questions and you're trying to have a conversation around a new feature or something. Okay, so that's the how not. Okay, I'm out of time, but I will be around if you have any questions. So I hope that was useful for you. Go forward, do some open source, and let us know if we can help in any way. So thank you.